Good evening, you're watching Future Talks. My name is Mark Grigorian. My guest today is head of administration, deputy head of administration of the president of Artsakh, and David Akopyan. It's going to be in Armenian. We've known each other for over 40 years now, so I simply cannot refer to him in plural. And as he agreed, we're going to speak to one another in a more colloquial way. So, David, given the general logic behind the discussion we're going to have, and also given that you're the first deputy chief of office of the president of Artsakh, I should also mention that you have worked with the United Nations for quite a long period of time in different countries that have been in the aftermath of the war. Which countries were there, by the way? Yes, thank you very much, Mark, for the invitation and for very interesting talks that you have at the Future Studios. I've been following all the meetings, and there are many countries, about 15, in which I've worked for 25 years with the United Nations. So to mention the countries I have worked for a longer time, Armenia is in the first place. Well, that was in the 90s, 4 years in Kyrgyzstan, and some of the Middle Asian states, 2001, 2005, and then I worked in Afghanistan, Somalia, and also worked in Syria in a post-war crisis situation. And but words are not enough to describe what was happening in these countries at the time. I worked in New York for some time, 2 times in New York. I was appointed to 2 different positions, and of course, short-term missions to Djibouti and Sudan and Jordan and etc. So I can continue the list of countries, and it really gives me a lot of. Well, I've been visiting a lot of countries, by the way. There've been about 85 countries I visited for different reasons, starting with the Caribbean. And I worked there for several months. I then traveled to Latin America and then Asia and Southeastern Asia. So it's quite an extensive spectrum. And issues I've been dealing with are quite significant, like development of the economy and statehood, etc. We can discuss these issues. All right, so it's enormous experiences, I can see. And I don't think that there's a second person like you who has the same experience in the Republic of Armenia. In that case, why Artsakh, not Armenia? Well, I was invited to Artsakh. That's very important. And I worked for the UN for quite a long period of time. And then you retire. So my family lives in California. I came to Armenia because I was interested in participating somehow, but I also sent the news to Artsakh that I was interested by means of my friends. You know, I like that. I mean, it's not that I like that, but that's where I feel that's my thing, kind of, as they say. I mean, the crisis situations, emergencies. So that's, well, I feel at home. That's the front line I have to be at, like in Kabul or Mogadishu, and something even harsher than that. So Artsakh is my motherland, and it doesn't matter whether that's Yerevan or Stepanakert, it's still part of the Armenian world. All right, clear. So this post-war chaos, maybe. Countries that find themselves in that situation might have some general trends for development, don't they? I mean, common trends that look like one another from one country to the other. So which are those trends, and which are the trends that are also applicable to Armenia and Artsakh situation today? You know, it's it is very difficult to say that there is a universal trend. Every country is unique. Indeed, I can say that cordially. It is like one separate life. I read about 20 books about Afghanistan until I went to Kabul, about the culture of that nation. I understood the Muslim culture. I understood it was very different from ours, but finally I managed to understand it. The same for Somalia, the same for Syria, Kyrgyzstan, etc. These are different worlds, starting from how they organize things, how they behave in teams, in groups, in society. And you have to understand that before appearing in that society. There are no written rules of communication. There's just human contact. You have to understand, you have to manage yourself. You try to demonstrate that you're not just a public official or an official of the United Nations to give advice and leave. You are here to work with them. And most importantly, you may apply part of it in the Republic of Armenia, is that building statehood is not something that should be done by a standard formula. I mean, you cannot say that the presidential constitution or semi-presidential or parliamentary ones are the best. For example, the one in Kyrgyzstan decided to completely reform its constitution. That was following the model of the one in France or the United States. Unfortunately, it didn't work well. The same in Armenia. We moved from presidential to parliamentary. Apparently, it's not working well, but the right balance. We can find the right balance by experience. I mean, in that context, at that historical moment, we need to understand what works and what can work better. So, one more important thing is nations. And when I say nations, I mean about 15 different nations with which I have quite interesting interaction. They're not trivial. They're not simple. They're not primitive systems. One tiny change may result in more significant changes. You should organize it in adaptive management, as they say in English. So you just make a tiny step, and then you see how system absorbs it, and then you fine tune your approach and make the corresponding steps further. You have to feel that all the time. The same is about Armenia. Well, of course, there is the static position where it's very difficult to make predictions about the future. In 60s, for example, there were books saying that the most promising countries of the world, according to the World Bank, were Philippines and Iran. That was 60s. They were saying at the time Northern Korea had, I'm sorry, Southern Korea had no chance to develop with various arguments. And then it turned out South Korea developed much faster than the countries they predicted would not. So there were no grounds for stating at the time that it had to be that way in South Korea, but ultimately the efforts of the nation brought the results in terms of reorganization, theory, and implementation. Okay, you conversed constitutions. So the current constitution of the Republic of Armenia looks quite a lot like the one in Kyrgyzstan, doesn't it? And you may also see a clear trend in post-Soviet states which strive for more democratic development, move towards parliamentary republics. Those that are more authoritarian or become totalitarian, they try the presidential better. However, it turns out ultimately that the countries that preferred the parliamentary model are also on the fence. They are like fluctuating. They increase the presidential element a little bit, then they go back to the parliamentary one, adding more weight to it. And that's what the Kyrgyz experience shows. Well, indeed, Kyrgyzstan is a very interesting example. And I've been present in these two so-called crowd revolutions when I mean it reached the point where my house was surrounded by the crowds. Fortunately, they did not penetrate. I had discussions with Akayev, with Rosa Tambayev, so I mean different leaders, and there were different opportunities to talk to them. So it seemed like the country, which was called the Island of Democracy in Malaysia now, it's not that case anymore, as it turned out that democracy was not an automatic solution to a lot of issues. So the issue was uh, maybe because they moved from presidential to parliamentary, and that's why they managed the democracy better. Nevertheless, it's about the model. How do you implement the model is the most important issue. Germany or Great Britain, you have to be consistent to the end in terms of its implementation. So it's not the model that is right or wrong, but the consistency in the actions. Clear. You are also a specialist of the countries. I don't know. I'm sure you've studied the experiences of these countries that went through a shocking situation. I mean, the word shock. Would you please speak about that a little more, about the societies a little? Well, you know, Mark, I had the opportunity to be invited to some universities in California, and I spoke about a society in shock and aftershock. They call it the disruptive development. Is when there is rupture in development and then it's a new quality of development taking place afterwards. There's one very interesting example. 65 million years ago, there was a huge asteroid that hit the planet. And about 3/4 of the living organisms were destroyed. At the time, the dinosaurs prevailed, and they all died. And tiny mammals, mouse size, survived. And through evolution, the civilizations that exist now emerged. Well, I don't know how the planet would look now if that asteroid hadn't hit it, but the example is, I mean, it means the following. It destroyed everything. It also destroyed the evolutionary chain because the dinosaurs ruled because they were strong. But apparently it turned out that it's not the strength that rules, but the evolutionary capacity is the one that ultimately prevails. And the same is about the shock in other countries, like the COVID shock, for example. After COVID, a lot people understood that a lot will change. Now it's not necessary to go to the offices. We now use the Zoom, and there are new opportunities all around. Armenia and the diaspora contact in some better platforms and ways. So that shock teaches us things that we did not want to deny because we simply adapted to that. Okay, then how can that shock support us in the future? What should be its incentive? For example, the most painful, horrible shock. Well, one was the collapse of the Soviet Union, no one expected. But then it was the collapse, then the earthquake, then the war. It's indeed a very strong shock for us. And now we had another one, the 44-day war, just horrible, awful experience we had, and there have to be certain lessons we should take from it, like what worked and what didn't work in our diplomacy, what didn't work in our economic policy, what didn't work in our strategies and tactics, I mean, etc. So numerous lessons we have to learn, and the shock is the one helping us, because we thought a lot of things were good, but it turned out they were not. So, but I mean, going back to your lesson is very important. There are lessons. That's how you should look at that experience. If you are ready, committed to learn that lesson, you won't experience the problem in the future, or at least it will be milder. Some shocks completely destroy societies. Somalia is one of the classical examples. They decided to start a war against Ethiopia, Soviet Union that was on Somalia's side first, then moved to Ethiopia's side, and then a civil war started, and then everyone against everyone. So for 30 years, and Somalia essentially was completely destroyed, and everyone was just armed, fighting against one another. So I mean, when I went there was complete chaos. No one even remembered statehood. They had forgotten that armed forces are not just people who do what they want, but armed forces the defense of your country. It's not for just collecting money from the population, but it's defending the country's population. So that's what happened after the shock. There can be complete chaos, and that's Somalia, which is an extreme example. The same could have happened here. We could have moved towards chaos. And one more example. When I moved to Afghanistan first time, I flew from Dushanbe. There was an American journalist flying with me, and she said, uh, every year they hit the ground, and it seems that that's the ground. But then I arrive the next year and I see that they are lower than that. That's 16 years already, and up to date they are still moving down. So it's a painful thing. I mean, it seems like there is no place where you stop and you hit the bottom. There is no bottom. You can continue deteriorating, and the whole thing is that when you stop and look ahead and start moving up to become more competitive, country of 21st century, we are truly worth of. Right, one main question here, and I guess the main problem is also there. How should we do that? Well, I'm sure that question is essentially the one that persists everywhere around for society. That's the most important question. How? Mark, it's not easy, of course. I mean, there is no recipe. There's no universal recipe you could have followed. But we must try more constructive discussion. At least we should attempt to move towards it. Like future of the army of the Armenian Republic. 15 goals we should pursue, starting from building the national vision and reunification with the diaspora and some leaps in the economy. But it's just not a list of dreams, of wishes. It's a plan, and it has to be supported by a reasonable strategy. So when I conversed the issue with some colleagues of mine in the government of Armenia, they told me we would become 5 out of 3 million in 30 years. I asked them how. How are you going to do that? You increase the birth rate, you reduce migration, you bring other foreign populations to Armenia. There was no answer to that, and it was still an issue. Like, okay, you devised the goal, how are you moving towards it? That's the biggest issue. So the discourse should occur around these issues, first of all. Like, all right, you want a leap and in development. Where do you see the unification between Artsakh, Armenia, and diaspora? What rights do you grant them? How do they participate in the building of statehood, etc.? So these are all quite specific issues, and frankly, I would prefer seeing political discussion on these matters in Armenia now rather than criticizing one another in a quite personified manner. That cannot take us into the future for sure, right? But I'm going back to this post-Soviet countries. The accepted version is that one. This guy is good, or this one's bad, so I'm voting for the first one, or I'm going to vote for another one so that I don't want this one, but I don't like both anyway. Well, Baltic states, I worked in Latvia for several months before joined the European Union, and the situation there was completely different. Maybe it is the culture that they were on the Soviet rule only for 40 years, not 70, but some generations still remembered the Soviet order. So they still managed to jump out of that system very quickly and join the European Union. They have about 25,000 GDP per capita. We are still ranging in 3,000 to 4,000. We're not able to make that leap. Yes, but we are now in a quite difficult situation. We went through 2 wars, Latvia had none. So as regards differences in developmental paths, we have very clear differences just between ourselves. Yes, and that, which is a problem, but an opportunity on the other side. And the Israeli example is great here. They have, in fact, less friends than we do in the region, but that mobilized the people. The Israeli kibbutzes, for example, to what extent would the local self-government be developed in Artsakh to reach the Israeli model? It's a Swiss model, very interesting one, by the way. For several hundreds of years, the communities were organized in terms of defending themselves and developing economically. So these types of models worked at the time. But Israel, about 30, 40 years ago, had the same population as Armenia and the same GDP per capita. Now they have it 30 times higher in GDP per capita and about 3 times more population. So external pressure sometimes makes the nations develop. It does not just weaken the nation and takes it to deterioration. Right, coming back to the electoral campaigns and the personas in Armenian elections. By now, our elections were held in the regime of assessing the past of the candidates. Does this guy have experience? How did he behave previously? How much money did he earn? Is he hungry or is he rich, etc.? So in the upcoming elections, we can already see that the word future is used very often. Does that really take us towards the future? Or that's just one of the political stereotypes that's being speculated? Well, I hope that it is one of the foundations. At the time, they said Moses needed 40 years to get rid of the past. By the way, an interesting example. Check it on Google. From Alexandria to Jerusalem, you need only 2 weeks. But Moses took his people for 40 years there. So we have been for 30 already. Maybe some faster changes going to happen in 21st century. A new generation has grown already in Armenia and in Artsakh, which I think has excellent properties and talents. And I feel lots of pleasure when talking to these children in terms of their willingness and commitment to cooperation. Unfortunately, they are not well represented politically, meaning they are not anyhow consolidated in any political parties, but I'm sure that's the future and it's being built right now. Well, what the results of these elections are going to be is a different issue. And the same is in Artsakh, by the way. For the last 2 weeks, I have been visiting 15 villages in Artsakh, just excellent children, bright children with their expectations ready for the new reality, for the new world. They read, they understand, they love their nature, but they want to be cosmopolitan at the same time. So it's a pleasure to try to help these children to find the best future for them and for Armenia. David, I've had the experience, I should say, I had the privilege to work with the youth of Artsakh for several years. And indeed, I'm impressed, I'm admired, and they're truly very sharp minds, very modern, very dynamic and active people. And of course, they're so nice that when I see them, I understand they have the bright future. They've earned the bright future, and I really want them to have it. However, and here we come back to war and post-war situation. So at this moment, well, at least I can say, I had the impression that people are in a kind of dynamic balance, and any change must ultimately bring emigration. And when I say emigration, I mean from an area that has some 100,000 people, it becomes dangerous. Well, it's a noticeable, complicated situation. And I've been visiting many villages, as I said. They tell me, okay, you have the experience now, tell us what our future is going to be. Well, naturally, I don't have the recipe. I can't go around telling people what the future is going to be. We are going to build our future, even in the arduous times. We are going to do that. And the reality is we have 4.5 years of a horizon at this moment. If Artsakh is going to be restructured, reorganized, managed in accordance with some different standards, then Armenia has to reunite economically in terms of the um, armed forces. So maybe we should train this youth so that they turn into something better and take the country to a better place. That might work. So if we're not able to manage the situation at this moment, and naturally we're trying, but it moves out very slowly because we are yet in the shock. We are yet under the stress. People who've lost their family members, very painful situation. It's a shock. But at the same time, there are very interesting situations with women who have lost their husbands, enthusiastically ready to create new lives for their children. There are such women who say they won't be living the country, they will have to create a better future for their children. And you know, there are also some interesting facts about Artsakh. It's been Armenian majority on that land for 3,000 years. I mean, there are very few areas in the Armenian highlands where Armenians have been majority all the time. And there were even harder moments in history, I'm sure. There were. And so essentially, this is not the worst crisis. There were worse crises, and I'm sure that they have the energy, and we have to be able to help them. So by being here myself, I'll try to do that. So some people have to come around and help. We have to bring collective effort to be able to solve the issue. Okay, just a short interruption to our discussion, and let me tell you that people who are watching now can ask questions, and we'll try to find the answers to these questions. And I'm sure David will find the answers. Okay, Elizaveta Davidovich, apparently residing in Israel, because she writes the following. Let me try translating. She says the Israeli kibbutzes are a model that is obsolete anymore because the state is not interested in providing financial assistance to them, and they have started a privatization process because I mean you cannot live in that regime of using subsidies from the state all the time. So if kibbutzes have something positive, they also have something negative. All right, I fully agree. When I mentioned kibbutzes, I also mentioned the Swiss communities model, and I didn't say one or the other is better or is the only one. We must try learning from those positive or negative results in an attempt to develop our own model. But the villages I have visited, where I saw the real leaders, mayors of those villages who were leaders, managed to bring the community together, managed to unite the people, succeeded in defending their lands, and the psychological situation is clearly visible. The attitude and the moods are different. So the model you choose and how you discuss its progress are the most important issues. You should take into account different experiences and find the most optimal model for Artsakh in this context. But the fact that people have to be better united as a community, that people have to do it together. It's not that they're trying to find individual solutions. They should come together to solve the problems they're facing. And there were communities who didn't even feel that unity because all of them pursued some of their personal issues, but there were others which were quite united. They had the will and the power and the enthusiasm and the desire to proceed. There are such communities in Armenia as well. There are some not that developed in terms of their collective activities, so we may try using their experience. Others can go and learn from the Swiss experience. That's why the Swiss experience is bottom up completely. Israel is slightly different, given kibbutz's role. But the approach that we have to try learning, not reproducing, not reiterating, not copying it. We have to take it into account in building our own model. But the most important is the time horizon that just uh, is going to be faced soon. That's 4.5 years Russian peacekeepers are going to be. So in this 4.5 years, we have to do things. That's where we have to start. We have to start now. Yes, start there and do so that 4.5 is not tipping point. Yes, of course. Some people will leave. Yeah, but 2 days ago, no, not even 2 days ago, just yesterday, I was in Verinshen. Hinshen, Verinshen, I mean, this 4 villages of Shishi with 200, 250 people residing, but there were villages with just 80 people, and there were 80 houses, mostly empty. Yeah, they're bouldering houses, but fantastic nature, fantastic landscape, and of course land plots. So, I mean, reorganization has to be taking place. They should turn into more productive agricultural activities, should maybe cooperate, solve some water related issues, road related issues. So they all have like small schools. One school had only 8 kids with 10 teachers, the other one something of that kind. So I mean, imagine how much they should bring it together in order to be able to reside and coexist and help children to ensure their continuous education, health related issues, etc. So this is all complex. I mean, I understand that most of the attention goes to building this 6,000 apartments for these people, but you must understand that 4 walls are not enough. People need social integration and jobs and quality life, which is possible to provide in Artsakh. In the bordering communities, yes, there is one more very important thing, is the feeling of safety, the security. People have to know that they are safe, and it's not that they think of waking up in a different reality in the morning, being scared of that. So that's very important. How are we going to provide for that? Well, you know, Mark, it's a very painful issue. For now, I've been in about 15 villages, as I said, and mostly bordering villages. So, meaning when you go there, you mostly see Azerbaijani flags on the hills around and the watches and everything. So, living in that environment is not that pleasant naturally. However, uh, in areas where Russian troops are displaced, uh, because they're not everywhere, they feel safe. So sometimes there are some incidents, but it doesn't happen a lot. So we need to have our own positions there, which is definitely not what I deal with. But it's up to us. I mean, it's neither the. I mean, it's either the armed forces of Armenia to go there, or we finally spoke of Israel. After all these developments, they are having a war right now in Jerusalem. So, and safety is not guaranteed, even in a state with one of the best armies in the world. So there are problems which will be there all the time. And unfortunately, there are no simple solutions to these problems. However, the devotion, the desire to stay on their land is a very strong factor. It's going to keep these people there. I'm sure most of them will stay. Very important, strong factor indeed. There is another question I have, David. Okay, so 2 or 3 weeks, or maybe 4 or 5 weeks, you've been in Stepanakert. So every time visiting Stepanakert, I hear stories of relations between Armenians and Azerbaijanis. They're different stories. One came and bought things from the market. Another offered his weapon for food. They exchanged tobacco, they exchanged cigarettes at the military posts, or a car just had to be fixed and people help each other, etc. So I think such communication is positive, isn't it? But I also understand that maybe most of these are legends. Is there hope that these relations will progress? Is there hope that on level of human relations, some things will work? Well, hope dies the last, as they say. I've also heard those conversations and those talks, like going to the red market, Karmir Shuka. I saw a big Azerbaijani court of vehicles, and I just asked, can we pass here? And they said, well, why are you asking? They're just passing on this road, and you can do the same. So this is a situation we have not created, but we have to live with it. So I think there are no significant relations between the two. Some villagers say yes, they see us from afar, because when we go to cultivate lands, they can see us and we can see them sometimes, but there has been no direct contact. One day it will happen, and I hope that day will come earlier, so that there is an opportunity. So the demonization from afar is something that happened in their nation and in our nation as well. People were told for years that Armenians were monsters and you should not talk to them. The same was done here in Armenia. So, but of course, these are people who live their lives, and there will naturally be possibilities to contact, because there will be some interaction, because there's a huge border and only a small part of it is now under the Russian peacekeepers' control. It's going to bring new opportunities and for communication, and we will have to live in that situation and manage that situation respectively. Yes, that's the situation. You're right, we haven't chosen to be in, but that's the situation where we have to uh, stay. And I have noticed, I don't know whether you have, that there is also some generational difference. I mean, our generation and the ones older, like 60 plus, they used to live with Azerbaijanis at a time and under Russian rule. So there are some news for our generation in the situation, but those are not that sonorous. For the younger generation, they are shocking, because they were born and raised with the attitude of having monsters over the border. That's what these children were told. And I'm sure we will not get to peace that way, but there will be only another war. Maybe we want that war. Maybe we need that war. Well, I don't think we do, but we must understand the reality. And we did not choose our neighbors. That's the historical reality where we existed for ages. Yes, we will need to continue this way. I myself drove through Nakhichevan and Ordubad and traveled back through Meri, and there were discussions and everything. So at the time, yeah, it was possible. So we need to understand that our conflict is not the first and the last conflict in the world. I had colleagues from India and Pakistan, the historically awful relations these two nations have. But recently, my colleagues from Pakistan, when the quantity of COVID cases confirmed grew, wrote that they expressed their condolences to Indian nation and wished everything was fine in India. So I mean, that antagonism that emerged in a situation where we won one of the wars and lost in the second, it's really very extreme. But there have to be some bridges for coexistence. I hope there is the rational approach. There is some reason that will prevail ultimately, and they will have to understand that we are here and we will be here. And building stronger Armenia is the issue number one for all the Armenians. Well, I don't say we should give only, we should also take, and we must develop a goal for ourselves, which is strong Armenia. But does not mean strong Armenia has to fight with everyone, but use that power only in extreme necessity. And of course, to bring the life to normal, we need political will. Political will, which we can't see in the opposite side. On the contrary, we see political will to discredit, diminish, destroy, aggravate, which unfortunately is never a solution to conflict. Thank you very much. My host, my guest today is David Akopyan, first deputy of staff of the president of Artsakh, a person who's had enormous, inestimable experience and contribution. Thank you. Thank you very much. And you're all welcome in Artsakh, really a picturesque place. Thank you, and see you again soon, hopefully.